The key methods that I recommend as part of the deep spiritual search are surrender and self-inquiry. And they're the methods that are recommended by Ramana Maharishi, and they are the methods that are basically recommended by the Advaita Vedanta tradition as a whole. These methods are quite dramatic and quite radical because they require a complete reorientation of your thought at every moment towards either looking for the I, that would be inquiry, or ignoring that thought and relaxing, that would be surrender. And so in doing so, they attempt to break the desire and fear-based identity machine that keeps the illusion of the individual self going, and to interrupt and jar that mechanism so that there can be this sort of revelation of something that's outside that. And hopefully by sort of having one experience that outside of thought over and over and over and over again, it'll be recognized that this outside of thought is actually you. The illusion will be understood for what it is. Because surrender and self-inquiry are so powerful, they exact a very high cost in the level of commitment one must have as a spiritual seeker. Namely, they are aiming to disrupt your sense of doing and controlling your life. At every moment, usually, the ordinary person is wrapped up in living their life, controlling their life, making decisions, all uncritically, without a second thought as to really who it is that's behind the curtain. For whom exactly are they making all these decisions? Who is the one that thinks they're making these decisions? Who is the one that's having these thoughts, right? These are all just sort of swept under the rug, these questions, and then, the ordinary person just engages in life wrapped up in, trying to get what they want and trying to avoid what they don't want. So in challenging this process, surrender and self-inquiry are posing a direct threat to your usual identity. And that can be very difficult to digest unless one's motivation is fairly strong. I mean, that motivation can be built up over time, actually, in a way. The spiritual search is a process of building that motivation, the end result of which will be perfect motivation, not the beginning. Because what happens is, as one touches surrender and self-inquiry, even very imperfectly, it starts to generate small amounts of peace. The mind likes that. It's starting to discover this sort of inner peace instead of an outer peace, and it gravitates towards that. And that increases the motivation for the spiritual search, and one is able to implement surrender and self-inquiry more and more as a result. And what that really means is, in the process of doing both those things, is one is worrying less and less about one's usual problems. You start to allow the mind and the body to take care of themselves more and just figure things out on their own, where your attention is diverted to surrender and self-inquiry. But every seeker, to varying extents, finds this difficult, precisely because they believe that they are in control. And if they don't control the mind and the body, they don't use that control, that they're going to not get what they want, and they're going to suffer, or they're not going to enjoy the pleasure that they wanted. So every seeker is engaged in this sort of battle to sort of overcome their resistance to doing things a different way. But, a fairly substantial amount of motivation and draw has to be there for a seeker to be able to engage in inquiry and surrender. And usually what does that really involve? It involves having a sufficient intellectual understanding of the non-dual process, and what sufficient means is different for different people. Some people need very, very little, and some people need a lot. I was in the second category, a lot of questions. It's dealing with one's emotional issues sufficiently. Again, what does that mean? It just means that one has enough concentration and desire for the spiritual that one is able to pursue it in a fairly consistent way, even if it's not perfect or even close to perfect. But just that sort of reasonably steady amount of desire, reasonably steady motivation to keep trying and get through frustration. That's enough. And emotional problems continue to be worked through in various ways, and dealing with emotional turbulence even while seeking through other means like therapy or artistic expression is always a wise thing to do, because the quieter mind that you have, the more effective your spiritual search. And the spiritual search gives you a quieter mind as well. So it's kind of a mutual cycle. All this is background to say, however, that because surrender and inquiry demand so much, namely that they are saying every waking moment, turn your attention away from what you think of as your normal life, as your normal way of doing things, as your normal way of thinking about things, as your normal way of making decisions, and turn your attention inward and stop worrying about ordinary life and look to who it is that would be worried about it in the first place, or simply ignore all that as noise. That is asking a lot. If one is unable and unwilling to do that to any serious extent, what's the next easiest step for a spiritual seeker to take? Well, I mean, there are different ways of looking at that issue, actually. For example, one could, go get psychoanalysis, and that could help untangle some of the knots of resistance that might be holding one back from the spiritual search, actually. So therapy could actually be, for example, a really good choice. I say therapy generally, but I really mean psychoanalysis specifically, since I'm a sort of a big advocate of that as a particular kind of therapy that I recommend. But traditionally, another approach has been given. There are many different approaches, frankly, that one could take short of surrender and self-inquiry as easier than surrender and self-inquiry. But one of the most powerful traditional approaches that's been given, it's given in the Bhagavad Gita, it's given elsewhere, is what's called karma yoga. Karma just means work. It's the yoga of work. And it's really extremely simple. All karma yoga says is this. It says, you know what? Okay, you can't do surrender and self-inquiry. That is, you can't directly at every moment give up or attempt to give up your usual sense of doing things. Fine. So go about your usual business. Continue to, wallow in the illusion, to some extent anyway, that you have control. Go ahead, do the things that you want to do, avoid the things that you don't want, stay in that driver's seat that you think you're in. But do this. Whatever activity you're doing, try to tell yourself that you don't care about the results. I mean, do your best. Do your best in whatever it is. But tell yourself emotionally that whether things go well or things go poorly, it's of no concern to you. That you're going to be indifferent to the results. That you're going to do the thing as best you can, whatever it is, out of a sense of duty, because you think it's the right thing to do, or even because it's the thing that you want to do. But you're going to put in the effort And then and as you put in the effort, you're going to say in advance, I'm emotionally detached from whatever the results are. And if you want, you can think of this as sacrificing or donating the results of your efforts to God, if you want to think along those lines. And you can, if you like, tell yourself that even as you do these things, that you're doing them is just an illusion, and that in fact everything is being done by the universe or by God, which is, basically true. So you can bring in these other attitudes, but the central attitude to have, and what Karma Yoga is saying is, do with a continuous attitude of indifference to results. So what does this do? So it's basically easier than surrender or self-inquiry because it's allowing you to, again, to stay in control. It's not challenging your normal thought processes. It's not saying every time a thought about work comes up to suddenly say, you know what, who is it that's thinking that? And to divert your attention from that thought about your work assignment to the I. It's saying, no, go ahead, do the work as you normally would, but do it with this attitude of, I have nothing to do with the results. I don't care either way. I'm merely going to do my best, and I'm going to not be affected. I'm not going to be affected by the results. So what does this do? It, over time, quiets the mind, basically, because it's cultivating equanimity of mind. There's less and less attachment to results. There's less attachment to desire and fear. And so this mindset is being cultivated where there's a kind of steadiness. When things go well, okay. When things go badly, okay, right? And so you're cultivating this attitude, but it's not as threatening to the mind as saying, just attack thought directly at all times, which is what surrender and self-inquiry are trying to do. So Karma Yoga is kind of an easier step, you might say. It's kind of preparatory step that will quiet the mind, allow one to become less attached to one's identity and desires and fears, and will eventually lead one, if you do Karma Yoga in a committed way, it will lead you to surrender and self-inquiry eventually. It will permit you eventually to do those things because you'll be less agitated, because you'll already have started to develop the idea that, it doesn't really matter what happens. It doesn't really matter what happens. So when you start that with that as an attitude, eventually it will become something that enables you to start to challenge the mind more directly. So that's all Karma Yoga is. Karma Yoga has, you can add the devotional component, like I said, offering the results of your actions to God, or you needn't if that doesn't appeal to you. But that's something that you can do if it feels like surrender and self-inquiry are just way too difficult for you at the moment, and or if it feels like you still have games to play in this world. You're not ready to be done with it yet. You still want to live a quote unquote normal life. And so if you still feel convinced of that, if you haven't been able to convince yourself emotionally that the spiritual is worth far more than that, then Karma Yoga is, again, something that could start to usher you down that path in a smoother, more gradual, softer, gentler manner.